Hello and welcome to ADRA's Voices from the Field. I'm Nina Prater, Agriculture Specialist with NCAT, and I'm joined by my fellow agriculture specialists, Audrey Kolde and Dufour, and today we're going to talk about Farmscaping, one of ADRA's older but ever popular publications. Farmscaping to Enhance Biological Control was written by Rex back in 2000, and it might be old enough to rent a car, but it is still full of relevant information. So today we're going to talk about what farmscaping is and why it's so beneficial to producers. Rex is going to share about some recent research he's been involved with, and we're just going to have fun geeking out about farm ecology and how cool it is. But it's not all sunshine and daisies. There are some upsetting statistics that make this work timely and critical. Insect populations have declined about 45% planet-wide in just the last 40 years. Bird populations have declined around the world by 25% since 1970, according to recent data, and bat populations were increasing until 2000, when the white nose syndrome fungus began reducing their populations, especially on the East Coast. Farmscaping can be part of the solution to bring back the health of not just our agricultural landscapes, but it can help restore all the ecosystems that are interwoven with farms and ranches that insects, birds, and bats rely on. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you today. Welcome, Audrey and Rex.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Rex, before we dive into deeper elements of farmscaping, it would be awesome for you to walk us through how you became interested in it and why it matters to you.
Okay, thanks for that question. My background is in entomology, and I graduated from UC Riverside with a master's in IPM, and then came north to Northern California, and I ran into a fellow, Bob Bugg. He's Dr. Bob Bugg. He was, at that time, a researcher at the University of California Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program. And he had this crazy idea. This was in the early 1980s, mind you. He had this crazy idea of like planting native perennials in the farm to provide nectar and pollen habitat for insects. And when I first heard this, I go like, oh, no farmers are going to do that. And the thing was, my studies at UC Riverside were, my master professor was Earl Oatman, who is since retired. And he was studying parasitism in broccoli and cauliflower and the cole crops, and he found, his results were kind of depressing because he found that the parasitism rates on some of the pests on these crops would never provide sufficient control. But he wasn't planting any habitat for these predators and parasites around his plots, which seems kind of basic today, but at that time it was standard procedure for these entomology plots to not provide any habitat. So anyway, I adopted farmscaping and began working with farmers, and they kept on talking about how fewer their pests were. And I thought, well, maybe there's something to this, and our farmscape, the agricultural system we've eliminated most of the habitat for beneficial insects and beneficial birds and bats. So farmscaping is pretty important in reestablishing an ecological system with checks and balances to control the pests.
Very cool. So you started defining farmscaping in that answer to Audrey's question, but I was wondering if you could explain a little further. What is farmscaping? What does it encompass?
Right. Farmscaping, as a definition, it's an ecological approach to pest management, and it can be defined as the use of like hedgerows, plants, cover crops, and water reservoirs to attract and support populations of beneficial organisms such as insects, bats, and birds. But I like to quote Wendell Berry, who's a ag philosopher, I guess you could say. And here's the quote: "The question we must deal with is not whether the domestic and the wild are separate or can be separated. It is how in the human economy their indissoluble and necessary connection can be properly maintained." And that's what this is all about. It's taking lessons from nature and incorporating them as much as possible into the managed ecosystem that are our farms.
I really like that framing of like maintaining connection, because that's such a positive approach instead of, I don't know, the term pest management, super important, obviously, but there's something negative about it, I guess, because it's pest focused, but maintaining connections between the natural and the managed, I guess. I don't know, it just has a positive spin that I like.
Yeah, and I think incorporating, like there's lessons from nature that we can incorporate into our systems. Nature, if you look at it, doesn't require any pesticides, any fertilizers. It's a self-fertilizing system. And, it begins with the soil and then works up into the above ground ecosystem as well. So I think we need to pay more attention, bring in some nature into the farms in order to provide the checks and balances that nature so ably provides.
I 100% could see how in the 1980s, this revolutionary idea could also lead to huge influences on organic regulations and on so many other of our niche styles of sustainable agriculture throughout the upcoming 30 years, 40 years since then. And really, every single one of those systems, including organic, has the soil as its foundation. And even with what you were just saying, the soil is that foundation in farmscaping as well. How does it play that connectivity, between connecting insects and soil and hedgerows and water reservoirs? How is all these practices that you mentioned connecting through that soil influenced by it?
Good question. And, I've taught several, pest management classes, ecological pest management classes, and I start with the soil because if the soil is so important, and I think a lot of farmers overlook the impact of healthy soils. And healthy soils, one, and primarily, they provide healthy, resilient plants. And healthy, resilient plants can better withstand insect and disease attacks than if you have a plant growing on poorly maintained and like organic matter deficient soils. As well as, so I purvey to farmers the idea of, get your soils in good shape. And, that's the first step in pest management, getting your soils in good shape. And also, most insects spend part of their life cycle in the soils, either as eggs, as larvae, as pupa, or as adults emerging from the pupa. So if you have healthy soils, there's a lot of critters in a healthy soil: bacteria, fungi, protozoa, all kinds of predators and parasites in the soil. And so it creates a balance in the ecosystem. And I won't go into the mycelia that infect the plants in a good way, and that the chemical biological feedback systems that they provide, because that's a whole nother podcast. But suffice it to say that pest management begins with the soil, and if you have healthy soils, you're going to have a healthy crop or healthier ecosystem.
And so you keep mentioning insects, which are a critical part of this interconnected ecosystem. So I was wondering, what habitats and practices should producers be providing to support insects, and what should people avoid in order to make sure they're not harming the insects?
Yeah, it's a simple question, but a very complex answer, I think. It depends on the crops you grow. It depends on where in the country you are. Out here in California, we plant a lot of hedgerows because the agricultural lands have kind of taken over the flatlands, and there's not that much habitat for the beneficial insects and other species. So hedgerows are a kind of a linear format of native. I like to provide native perennials. You can use some Mediterranean plants like rosemary and some of those others that are native to the Mediterranean area. But the best ones, I think, are native perennials to California or the West Coast. And out here in California, we have pretty mild winters in the agricultural areas. So you can design a hedgerow that provides nectar and pollen resources throughout the whole year, as well as provides uncultivated ground. Most areas in most flatlands in California that have irrigation are cultivated, and 85% of the native bee populations are ground nesters, which require uncultivated ground. And so we've really hammered the native bee populations just through cultivating our ground. So hedgerows provide an uncultivated area where native bees can nest. And I remember seeing a velvet ant. Now, velvet ants, they come in two different colors. They're Hymenoptera. They're considered a wingless wasp. And they come in a beige color and they come in a rust red color. But I remember seeing it on my brother-in-law's farm. He has hedgerows, and I saw this on a coyote bush. And this critter is a parasite of ground nesting bees. And so if you see a velvet ant, there's a pretty good population of ground nesting bees to provide its habitat. So,
is there anything you think about specifically in regards to, you mentioned native plants, and I know as well there's a lot that happens with those native plants as far as each region, phenology, and when they're
yes.
blooming. But then you're also getting into specifics of when what the insects need as far as all of the elements as well.
Yeah, and managing your farm in an ecological sense requires more information, more knowledge by the farmers. And so it's ideal if a farmer can learn about what are the endemic native beneficials like syrphid flies or robber flies or green lacewings or, ladybird beetles are kind of universal across our country. But what will attract them and what pests he has? It's ideal for farmers. I know farmers are super busy. They have so many, they're juggling finances, they're juggling, soils, they're juggling crops and markets and all that. But part of it is knowledge of the ecology and the ecology of the pests as well as the beneficials. So they're more able to target their plantings, their beneficial plantings, toward what would be able to manage or provide checks and balances to their pests. But you don't want to just plant native perennials randomly either, here in California. So if you have an apple or a pear orchard, you don't want to plant toyon, which is also called Christmas berry. It's a very attractive plant. It blooms in early spring. Lots of beneficials go to it, but it is also a host to fire blight. It attacks pears and apples, but especially pears. And so if you have an orchard of these crops, you don't want to plant toyon as it will be a host of fire blight, and you don't want that. So, know your crop, know the plants you're planting, and there's a lot of resources out there, and we'll talk about them later in the podcast.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to hear some more resources for sure. I do want to bring us back to one of the practices you said was like fundamental, right? Whenever you start talking about insects, and that's the hedgerows, that habitat that you're building with these hedgerows, which is an NRCS conservation practice number 422. If you're thinking about establishing them, I would love to hear a little bit more about the hedgerows overall and just how that plays such a key role in this farmscaping world that we're talking about.
Well, hedgerows provide a lot more benefits than just providing a habitat for beneficial insects. And if you go along a hedgerow, if you walk along a hedgerow, you'll notice, there's birds in the hedgerow. Some of these hedgerows, like my brother-in-law's farm, they were planted 20, 25, 30 years ago. So some of these hedgerow plants are pretty good size, and provides nesting habitat for birds. And most birds, even hummingbirds, are insectivores when they're rearing their chicks and, laying eggs because they need that protein. Hedgerows provide that. They provide windbreak. They can provide dust control. If you plant a hedgerow next to a farm road, it will reduce the amount of dust going over into your field. And dust exacerbates mite explosions, spider mite explosions, especially. And you don't want them because they're very difficult to control. And I think last but not least, it provides some beauty in our agricultural landscapes. And I've gone through fields in California. I've taken pictures of bare ground going off into the horizon. And, I've traveled through Texas. That's kind of the same thing. I mean, anywhere in the States, there's bare ground, and it doesn't provide habitat for anything other than perhaps diseases in the soil. So that it provides a little bit of beauty in the agricultural landscape. And farmers that have planted hedgerows, sometimes they become so enamored with hedgerows, they just start planting them all over. But they do provide other benefits as well.
I know this is one thing I think about with hedgerows. It's very British minding, like that word reminds me very British garden vibes. Is there a distinction in between those two as far as like what the British mean when they say hedgerow versus what we're talking about with farmers planting hedgerows?
In the U.S., there were hedgerows. There were places between fields that farmers didn't plant anything on, and generally trees or bushes grew up in these areas. And back in the 70s, we had a Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon, Earl Butz. He said, plant fence line to fence line, and he was quoted as "get big or get out." So at that time, we were supplying Russia with grains because they were deficient in grains, and that was a huge market for us at that time. Farmers took his advice and farms got bigger. They got rid of hedgerows in the US. It's probably happening over in Britain too, but now we're more intentional about planting hedgerows. You want native perennials, and they can be trees or bushes. It depends, talk to the farmer and see what they want as far as what the options are, as far as hedgerow plants are, hedgerow species, what they might provide. And, the farmer can decide, because if the farmer is involved with decision making and planting, he'll tend to appreciate it more and benefit more from it as well.
Also thinking back to like, we have those two NCAT resources as well, the pictorial guide to hedgerows, and also a while ago, Catherine, who used to work for NCAT, wrote a conservation hedgerow for the Southwest. And I think it just more so I need to get out of my head of like a single variety of hedge that's like shaped into Edward Scissorhands vibe. I think that's probably what I need to get out of, instead that it's like a full ecosystem of variety and biodiversity that you're planting along this row.
Yeah. And I think, for each region, like we have certain species we like to plant here in California that might work up in Southern Oregon or even Southern Washington, maybe some parts of Nevada, but in Texas, maybe not. Or in Louisiana, it's a whole different ecosystem. But there are resources, Xerces, for example, they have lists of annual and native perennials for each region that will grow. So don't plant coyote bush in upstate New York, it won't do well.
So hedgerows we're talking about that go on the edge of field. We have the rest of the field to look at where we can do some farmscaping. So I want to pivot to talking about cover crops, which are often thought of as a soil health practice. But how are they also a farmscaping practice?
Right. Well, cover crops are important in a number of different ways. I mean, they can provide nectar and pollen resources during part of the season, particularly legumes, but there's non-legumes like mustards. There's Phacelia, which is a native of California that the Europeans took and turned into a hedgerow or an annual wildflower cover crop. And then now we're using it as such as well. Cover crops can really be, farmers are pretty creative, or some farmers can be really creative. And so the cover crops can provide nectar and pollen resources. They also can provide organic matter to the soil through their root exudates, as well as their, when you disc them in or use them as a mulch, they can cover the soil and protect the soil from solar radiation and reduce evaporation, but also add organic matter to the soil. So you're getting multiple benefits from the cover crops. I want to go back a little bit to hedgerow plants because you don't necessarily have to plant hedgerows in a 1,000-foot line along the edge of your property. I call these, there's unused portions of fields, around irrigation structures, around, if you have a center pivot, the corners of a center pivot are typically unused and generally pretty weedy, but you can plant those with native annuals or perennials and reduce the weed problem to boot. And but these things I call biodiversity islands. They provide a little biodiversity, nectar and pollen resources, nesting places for birds, and they reduce the weed populations that spread onto your fields. So you get a kind of double benefit from those biodiversity islands, and it creates a little bit of beauty on your farm too.
Very cool. I like that mental image of islands of biodiversity. Part of me thinks that pockets like that are what are going to save us. Are there any cover crop species that you want to highlight that are sort of farmscaping superstars, or is it very region specific?
I think it's region specific. I think it's, before I recommend any cover crops or anything to a farmer, I take soil samples, send them into the lab, get the analysis back. And typically out here, the soils have been tilled and tilled and tilled. And, maybe the farmers aren't using compost. They're not using cover crops. They're just tilling the crop residue back in. But that often doesn't maintain the organic matter levels at probably where you want them to be. It depends on the organic matter levels, which are typically out here in California, maybe 0.5% to 2.5% or 3%. 3%, I would say, is the farmer's doing a pretty good job. There's some muck soils that go up to like 12 and 15% or 20%, but those are leftovers from being at the bottom of a lake or the bottom of a river system or a delta. So first, look at the nitrogen levels, look at the organic matter levels, and you can recommend, or I have recommended in the past, straight legume cover crops because their nitrogen levels are so low, or a mix of nitrogen and grasses or nitrogen and mustards, or depending on the situation they have, and also what kinds of tools they have available. Because a lot of small farmers don't have flail mowers. They just have a disc, a bed shaper, maybe a tractor, or even a rototiller on some of the smaller farms. So you have to work with a farmer to figure out a cover crop that is appropriate for that particular farm and the soil ecosystem.
But as a whole, whenever you're thinking of cover crops as part of your farmscaping system, it has less to do with them as a food source for like blooms. And it has more to do with like building your soil health, the same intention kind of behind it. I remember learning that you're not supposed to let your cover crop go all the way to seed because some of the nutrients gets lost. And I always have a memory of like my early farm. We felt so bad because we would try and let the buckwheat go as long as possible because we're like, the bees
Oh,
are so happy. How am I going
yeah.
to? I just want to lay in it and let them buzz around me. But yeah, like when always knowing you're balancing that soil health with the fact that I'm like the pollination of it is giving these bees so much happiness.
Well, did you have buckwheat weeds come up after that?
I mean, yes, but
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like I recommend for any legume or any flowering crop, when the flowers reach about a third to a half of the plants, like you want to not let them go to seed, particularly with long-lived seeds, and buckwheat I include in that. And vetch as well. On the other hand, in orchard crops, you want the seed because that reduces your seed input costs down the line, but it depends on what kind of orchard you have and like what access you need for the machinery that is either pruning or harvesting the crop. We did a cover crop for a pecan orchard north of here a few years back. We had a 3-year project. I really liked this project because we were able to design a 14 species cover crop for the orchard. What we did was we tracked the beneficials. We did sweeps at 10 different locations throughout the orchard. It was a 320-acre orchard, so it was, a good-sized orchard. So we swept for beneficials every 2 weeks and then monitored. We had sticky traps up in the tree at 10 locations around the property. And then we monitored for whatever bugs went up into and got stuck in the sticky trap, and then did weekly monitoring for aphid populations, which is there are 3 species of aphids that attack pecans in California. And pecans are a minor crop in California. We only have maybe 10 or 12,000 acres compared to a couple million for almonds, 500,000 for pistachios and walnut nuts each. So pecans are a drop in the bucket. We learned that some of the late growing, like we planted this 14 species cover crop, it had Persian clover, crimson clover, yarrow, California buckwheat. There were a couple grasses, and we put in 2 milkweeds. Milkweeds I put them in hedgerows as a native perennial, which it is, but it's a warm season plant. And so all these clovers and things, grew really well, overshadowed. Like we didn't see in this one pecan orchard, we didn't see a single milkweed ever come up. So that was a lesson learned. In another pecan orchard that we planted, we did see the milkweeds come up, but that orchard ended up, they wanted to run sheep through the cover crop. And so they didn't want any milkweed because it's not good for sheep. But so, yeah, we monitored and the pest control advisor this orchard was using had never worked with a cover crop, which is probably pretty typical of the pest control advisors in California because they usually work for chemical companies, and not to say that they recommend pesticide use as a part of their pay. Anyway,
it's a new approach.
It's a new approach, right?
Yeah,
it's a new approach. Yeah.
You're doing a lot of
And
preventative IPM instead of reactive.
yeah. And spraying is easier than doing cover crops. And, I monitored the beneficial populations, and at some point in time, the farmer had to mow down the cover crop. And initially we thought, and the farmer didn't realize his flail mower only went to a couple inches. He had initially thought he could mow, and I had asked him to mow it like 6 inches so the cover crop the clovers and stuff would recover very well. That didn't happen. So I asked him to wait a couple weeks before he mowed. He mowed every other row, and then the alternate row was mowed like 2 weeks later. So that saved some of the beneficials. It went later on into the season. The populations of aphids, they were mostly managed by the cover crop, or the beneficials that were coming into the cover crop. One instance, and this is kind of a sideline to this story, but we did this from 2019 to 2022. That coincided with a couple years of massive fires in California. So I was monitoring the aphid populations. I had other staff to come with me to monitor the beneficial populations and such. One week, I just wasn't going to monitor the aphid populations because, one, they had exceeded the aphid population, the economic threshold. The economic threshold was 20, the average of 20 per 10 leaves at each location. It was up around 30. And there was this 1 week, it was triple digit temperatures. The air quality was in the 700 or 800, which is not good. It was in the purple range, like don't go outside. And so I decided not to monitor that week. And then I monitored the week following that. And the aphid populations went from 30 to 10. And I thought, wow, one thing, we're geeking out on insect physiology here, but insects breathe passively through only two spiracles, one on each side of their abdomen, right? And so I suspect that the aphid population was decimated by the smoke. They literally could not breathe, and so they died. What about the beneficial insect population too? So as fires become more and more widespread, I think that might be something that USDA or NRCS wants to pay attention to. Like, more research needs to be done on that, because the smoke is going to be with us more than in the past, I think.
It's something entomologists are looking at all over, just as CO2 levels are changing, and
yeah.
As well as nitrogen. We're looking at all the facts of our atmosphere, because yes, they affect our weather, but also they are literally affecting the physiology of certain plants and animals. We're getting, one of the classic elements is we're talking about invasive or new pests. And so that is like a huge thing, border, as they cross borders into new states. In Louisiana, we just had a rice pest cross from Texas into Louisiana. We have a new cotton one. It's like, it's just been a big couple of years for some of our cash crops to get some new pests. And I think, it's part of this whole element of like, well, how do we prevent that? And so you're talking about hedgerows as part of it. And you're talking about cover crops in order to help maintain this health, so that that first one that comes over from a shared equipment or whatever it is, can get defeated and not get a hold. And so, and I know you wrote a blog after that happened as well, that we can link in the show notes as well, about creating habitat for beneficials to control aphids and pecans. And it shows the graphs that you're talking about in that week that you missed. That's such a funny little tidbit to know, as you see the graph of like, and it crosses the threshold, and then there's no data, and then it's just like back to normal. And so like knowing it's in part because the predators were catching up, and partially because it was a sucky time to be outside. And the insects were also like, peace, I can't do it.
That's so fascinating. And you said pecans aren't that big a crop in California, but I'm just thinking about in the Southeast, they're pretty crop. So huge. I wonder, I haven't looked into this at all, but I wonder if any of the concepts you talked about cover cropping to control aphids are happening in the Southeast. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Well, I read prior to this project, I read up on whatever information I could find, which was from the Southeast. They have a different set of pests. I mean, they have those aphids, but they have a whole different set of pests, like pecan borers and others that we don't have out here in California yet.
So we've covered a lot of the different elements. We've got earth, fire, air, wind. Let's talk about water. How does water play a role in farmscaping, and what should people think about when they think about water? And you mentioned water reservoirs. What's the best use of water in the farmscape?
So there's a couple different things. One is water is habitat. Like you can plant marsh plants or riverine kinds of riparian zone plants around a reservoir as habitat. But also two main predators, damselflies and dragonflies. They're naiads, which are their immature forms, live in the water and they're predators in the water. If you have like a pond or a reservoir, you'll have probably more population of dragonflies and damselflies. And damselflies will go after gnats and mosquitoes, and they're smaller and less robust than the dragonflies. Dragonflies will go; they're aerial predators, and they can snag moths and things like that, and they're pretty formidable predators. And I've noticed in my time, kayaking that the damselflies will fly like lower, like up to a foot over the water. The dragonflies are patrolling higher up. I don't know if that's the same on land. It seems like they've divided up the aerial predatory.
And their diet's the same, you said?
Well, they're both predators. Damselflies eat smaller insects, mosquitoes and gnats and those types. Dragonflies can eat larger insects as well. Back to the water issue, a lot of bats drink on the fly. So you need a body of water at least, 15 feet long as the bats come down and they kind of skim the water and they drink on the fly. That provides a water source for bats. I mean, bats can have a pretty extensive range, but if you have a water source on your farm, that will tend to keep them on the farm and, predate on the farm.
What about like amphibians and stuff?
Well, depending on how the pond or reservoir is managed, because a lot of times it's just especially if you have grazing animals, all the manure ends up kind of in the pond and you have like a lot of algae blooms and things like that. But if it's just kind of a pond that's spring fed or just a runoff pond that is from ungrazed land, there can be amphibians that are part of the checks and balances. Amphibians eat insects. Frogs eat insects. That's part of the whole system of checks and balances. And plus, you have maybe wading birds. It diversifies your ecosystem and enhances the structure of your ecosystem. So provides more checks and balances.
Ponds are super cool. They provide, I feel like, so many different benefits that I don't even understand fully because it has to do, you start getting into like your water tables and things like that as well.
Well, it's also sediment, like there's NRCS cost share for settling ponds too, and so it catches a runoff, it settles all the soil that you're losing or most of the soil that you're losing off your croplands. And, you can, after it's dried out, you can scoop that up and kind of put it back where it belongs, if you have that notion.
How do you make sure that these practices are really getting specific enough to you? I know you mentioned that really conservation farming requires a lot of knowledge. And one of the elements that people have talked about with farmscaping is like really refining it to the right moment. Otherwise, you get what they call like a chocolate box ecology, where it's just you're letting everything thrive instead of the creatures you want to really see for your farm's betterment and for that financial benefit. Do you have any wisdom to share on what resources you're really doing to help really narrow down what plants and practices you need to be doing for your farm?
It depends. I guess a lot of answers to any question in farming is it depends, and It depends on the farm, on the farmscape, on the abilities of the farmer and what kind of tools they have access to. When I take soil samples from a farm, I talk to the farmer and ask him what his problems are or what her problems are, and just walk around the farm to see what conservation opportunities there might be. At the same time, trying to educate, like a lot of farmers don't have much knowledge about the soil. They know they should put a certain fertilizer on at a certain time. The soil is the most complex ecology on the planet, or it can be. I think we've simplified the soil system to NPK and maybe calcium. It's more complex ecology than that. And I learn from farmers, like skilled farmers, and then I try and pass on that knowledge to farmers that want to do the right thing, but they don't have the knowledge. And I've learned, and what I like about this job is it's continual education. Learn, like soils are so complex, learn new stuff every day or every year. Just the farm's ecology, that's all the wisdom I can pass on, though.
I know you have lots of wisdom to pass on, Rex, and I feel like we should probably start wrapping up. But I didn't want to end before you shared some interesting fun facts about spiders.
Thank you for asking that. All right, spiders. When I was studying entomology, spiders were back in the last century. Um, Spiders were not considered they were not an agricultural component at all. They have a softer exoskeleton than insects, which makes them more susceptible to extremes of heat and cold and humidity. But oftentimes they are the first predators that arrive into an agricultural ecosystem due to their parachuting, which is spider. And matter of fact, yesterday I saw, some silks, parachuting spiders, just walking around Cache Creek. And so what they do is they crawl up on a plant and they start extruding their silk. They do this preferably on a windy day. And sometimes there's so much silk, people ask about like what is going on. There's silk over like telephone wires and all trees, and it it can be pretty apparent sometimes. But so they parachute in, they're the first predator in an ecosystem. But if you don't have mulch or a cover crop or something, they'll probably succumb to the weather, or they like having mulch there. They like having hedgerows and those kinds of habitats. And when you think about spiders, there's jumping spiders, there's crab spider. Jumping spiders are, they're attack predators. Crab spiders are ambush predators. They'll wait on a flower until some insect comes by and grabs them. Wolf spiders are ground predators. There's orb spiders that are web weavers, and I've seen on a good organic system walking between rows of steak tomatoes or whatever. There's a lot of spiders. And also, spiders eat more, they kill more insects than they can consume, as well as if they are present on a plant and a pest comes in, and it's not all pests, but a certain group of pests, they land on the plant and they detect a spider, they'll abandon that plant. And there was a study done by a researcher in Colorado, I can't remember her name, but she said that there's more diversity in spiders in a farm with, bushes and like a hedgerow system on a farm than otherwise would be the case. Yeah, spiders are interesting critters, and the more diverse ecosystem you have, the more spiders you'll have. So thank you for that question.
I certainly never really thought about spiders in the agroecosystem context. I let them stay in my house because I know they're eating the fruit flies, but I'd never thought about them in a farmer's fields, and so I just thought that was really interesting. Yeah, I know we have so much to cover. We want to talk about birds and bats, and so maybe we could just end on talking about, we've mentioned a lot of this, but reiterating what benefits farmers will see from implementing some of these farmscaping practices and where they can go for more information.
Right. An ecological approach to pest management has follow-on benefits for your soil, the health of your crops. It also probably on the financial side, if you spend less on pesticides and pesticide application and less on fertilizers, through the use of cover crops, your finances will definitely improve. And I've invited Adam Chappell, who's a cotton farmer in eastern Arkansas, to a couple talks, and he has documented irrigation savings, seed cost savings, pest management savings across the board since he's been using cover crops. There's financial benefits, there's production benefits. And I think there's the idea of like farmers being conservators of our natural systems. And there's that. And there's the beauty that having a cover crop or a hedgerow can provide. And so I would say if you're interested in farmscaping, plant a short hedgerow, 20, 30 meters or 20, 30 yards, 100 feet, and see how that does. And then you can go from there. If you like what it does, plant more. If you want to plant a cover crop, start small, because starting small, you tend to make smaller mistakes. And so a lot of farmers can't afford large mistakes because they're on the edge of financial stability. So out here, we have the Wild Farm Alliance. They've done a lot of good work on information about hedgerows as well as birds and what they eat and how they interact with the farm system. Xerces Society they have a great website, and part of their website has areas of west, northeast. They divide the country into like 4 or 5 areas, and they have lists of plants, annuals and perennials, that are native to each of those locations. And of course, my favorite website is the ATRA website. And there's information on farmscaping and the pictorial guide. We also have that the pest management database that you can look up organic and or low risk pesticides by pest or by pesticide trade name, and also has a lot of information about beneficial insects and soils.
Yay, thank you. And we'll add a link to all of that in the show notes, to our ATRA resources that we've mentioned, as well as to the further resources with Wild Farm Alliance and Xerces Society. Also, if you're looking to learn more, go ahead and explore those resources. But yes. Thank you so much, Rex. And if you haven't read the Biorational or the Farmscaping to Enhance Biological Control, you should.
Thank you so much, Rex. And maybe we'll have to convene again to do part 2 because this was so much fun and we didn't get to some other fun stuff. So,
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.